In the Pursuit of Truth. Dowley. Chapter 7. Blessing in Disguise. Destiny was capricious, as sometimes things just happened that people learned to grapple with. The company Dr. reported to was in the business of making chemical agents for use in textile industry. It was situated on the east side of the Huangpu River. The dormitory for male students was actually outside the walled facility, in an old, shabby hut rented from local farmers. 12 students were squeezed in this 20-square-meter shed with 6 double-deck beds standing on the mud floor. Inside, the air was filled with the gross smell of mildew. Right outside was a wooden bucket as urinal. When the bunch of outcasts arrived, many started shaking their heads, and some uttered curses. This was not really a place fitted for human habitation. "You have seen worse conditions in your life, haven't you?" said the class leader, who seemed to be a good-natured guy. "Have you been to the countryside to till the land during high school? So what's the big deal?" "Right," another student replied sarcastically. "We will be paid to study chemistry. Guess we cannot complain too much about the dorm. Home is only an hour away. See what I mean?" Students took out mosquito nets that they brought from home and began to mount them to the wooden frame of the beds, with a lot of hustling and bustling. All of a sudden, a loud clapping sound was heard with a curse. A mosquito inside a net was killed. Gradually things calmed down. It was 9 in the evening, and lights were turned off. Most dwellers soon fell into sleep in the privacy of their nets. Those still awake were accompanied by the symphony of snoring. The work-study program was an invention. The industries recruited high school graduates to work half of the time in the plant and to take courses during the other half on an alternating bi-weekly schedule. As to the compensation, the program participants got what amounted to approximately half the starting salary of a full-time employee. When the textbooks were distributed the next day, there was a little commotion in the classroom. "What is this? The organic chemistry is a college textbook, but the analytical chemistry is for vocational schools. This curriculum is neither fish nor fowl," a few students protested. The counselor, an official from the company in charge of the program, did not budge. "Tell me which textbook is too easy for you, and I will give you a test to see if you truly understand," he retorted. Did the students not know it was not their welcome party to the college? Of course, they knew. Some had to ask silly questions, as a way to vent their disappointment, frustration, and even anger. Many here had unpleasant stories about themselves, just like Dr., but they were not ready to share in their first days in the factory. The teachers of analytical chemistry and chemical process were veterans. They came on time, gave their lectures, assigned homework, and left as soon as the bell rang. The organic chemistry teacher, a recent college graduate, was available after class for questions. There was nothing really exciting or spectacular, but practical knowledge was conveyed. It did not take long before most of the work-study participants became skilled enough to operate in the workshops without supervision. With 3 years mandatory chemistry courses previously in secondary schools, those who really learned then already had pretty solid understanding of the basic principles of chemistry. Now they further enriched themselves and applied the knowledge in production. The old workers in the plant were impressed. The job they were actually doing, by today's standard and custom in the United States, were equivalent to that of a technician. As we understand here, the word technician represents a job description, it reflects what one does in industry. But in those years in China, technician or engineer were professional titles that usually went along with a person's academic qualification, schooling, and diploma. In industry, a college graduate was automatically granted a technician title, even if what he did might actually be administrative work. Several years of work experience plus peer recognition usually led to a promotion to an engineer title. In that sense, technician and engineer were like ranks. However, regular promotion of the college graduate stopped during the Cultural Revolution years. Technicians remained technicians for more than a decade. As to Dr. and his classmates/co-workers, they were called operators. There was something Dr. actually liked about industry better than school. Political meetings were much less frequent. People were more pragmatic and less phony. Party cadres told dirty jokes and did not pretend to be ethics models for you to follow. And what surprised Dr. most was the respect that average blue-collar colleagues held toward intellectuals. They told Dr. the anecdotes of those senior engineers in the factory who had the best product knowledge and what newcomers could learn from them. In a society full of political controversies, the level of consensus in recognizing the talent was palpable. It seemed to be embedded in Chinese culture. The tradition was alive and well, despite the effort by the authorities to downplay it. This was the routine of the daily work. At the beginning of every work shift, the group would collect raw materials from the warehouse, deliver them to the workshop, weigh them, and add them into reaction vessels as big as 1,000 liters. Then the shift leader would start the reaction. At the end of the reaction, the group would gather again to discharge the product in the vessel to small containers, either jars or metal barrels already fitted with plastics bags. When the batch of chemical reaction was going on, only a couple of operators were needed to monitor the process. For most people, it was break time where they could simply sit and chat in the locker rooms. Those were days when life seemed to be calm and untroubled, as Dr. was able to stay away from politics. To him the factory was more a sanctuary than a confinement. Here, at least for the moment, human activities were revolving around a clear and practical purpose: manufacturing. Dr. spent most of the time inside the workshop, sitting by the reaction vessels. He did a lot of reading there as the motors were humming and the stirrers of the reaction vessels were turning. When they came to a stop, the hissing sound of the steam leaking from the pipe's flannel connections reminded him that this was still a place full of energy. Daily activities could be totally repetitious, but they provided the most precious thing: time. The time not wasted in brainwashing, but time at Dr's own disposal and time for his self-study. Political movements came and went. Knowledge and expertise were there for him to acquire. No one could take that away. The peace did not last long as the Cultural Revolution broke out in the summer of 1966, causing disturbance in this political safe haven. Radicals took revolutionary actions against a dozen of former factory owners. It usually meant rounding them up, searching their homes, confiscating their belongings, making them confess crimes, parading them, holding struggle meetings in the auditorium, forcing them on their knees on the stage, and shouting the "down with so-and-so" slogans. A few overly zealous combatants would give the class enemies a few slaps on the face and kicks to the buttocks to go along with some curses. This was, however, considered relatively mild compared to many truly horrible stories nationwide, where many people were actually killed. In the rest of 1966, that was the status of the political campaign in the factory. Most employees and students were bystanders. As 1967 came, the rebel faction of workers in Shanghai seized political power with Mao's support. To Dr's surprise, the unpopular party officials in the factory were actually overthrown by the rebels, composed of self-organized ordinary people. For a few months, Dr. thought that perhaps this time people were truly given their own voice. As most inside the factory wall began to get involved in the debates, Dr. could not help expressing his own opinions. But factionalism was fierce, and it turned to meaningless and senseless civil war, which often turned violent. Dr. soon realized that the participants of the movements were only pawns in the big political game. He was disillusioned. The more politics changed, the more they remained the same. After a short excursion, it was time for him to go back to self-study. Dr. was in a profession not of his own choosing. But in those days, how many people actually had their own choices? He was only glad that his fate with chemistry was not a mismatch. Chemistry was his favorite subject of junior high as he was fascinated by Mendeleev. As a senior, his focus shifted to physics as Newton became his idol. But his general interest in natural sciences always remained strong. In this post-high school work-study program, he found renewed interest in chemistry, but this time as a tool to solve the problems in manufacturing. Although the opportunity of college education seemed to have passed, his desire to demonstrate that he had the talent to make a difference in the society remained strong. Research was not in his job description, but it did not have to be. To discover and innovate were as exciting as they were noble. In one case, he removed kerosene in the formulation of an adhesive agent, reducing the cost while maintaining its desired property. In another case, he found that adjusting the ratio of the reactants would drive the reaction to its completion, greatly improving the quality of the water-repellent product. So as he collected the roughly 20 yuan monthly salary, which amounted to the value of 2 dress shirts, he felt he really earned it. The work-study program ended without a ceremony. When the 3-year term expired, all students automatically graduated, acquired the formal employee status, and officially became workers. However, whether they would all be treated as working class politically was yet another matter. In retrospect, those years of late 60s were not as disappointing as Dr. anticipated. In the midst of the political upheaval of the society, that was a period of relative stability in his life. Nationwide, teenage Red Guards were sent by Mao to the countryside to be farmers, under the political slogan of receiving re-education from poor and lower-middle-class peasants. College students wasted their chance of learning in the midst of the turmoil. In the years due for their graduation, most were sent to remote provinces where daily life was extremely hard. Those who had missed higher education but stayed in Shanghai with a job in industry actually became the envy of the time. For Dr. in that period of time, what life offered him by accident was not just the familiar location or a job he happened to land on. It was the time at his disposal to do some serious self-study. It would turn out to be tremendously beneficial in the long run. Famous English writer Robert Louis Stevenson once said, "We should strive to go on in fortune and misfortune like a clock during a thunderstorm." This was what Dr. did in those years of his early life. What else Dr. lived through and what the culture life during those years was like. Please follow Chapter 8, Boredom.